Day 2 of Writers Week. Kind of a slightly tepid response there. We're small in number, but we're going to be loud. Great to see you. Shout out to Mr. Anderson, 7th period AP Lit class. And all of you. We're going to get started here in a minute or two. Just a few quick thank yous before we do so. None of this would be possible without the support of the Fremd Booster Club. I know a lot of your parents are boosters, and so when you go home today and you know that they're a booster, give them a thank you. Let them know something that you saw today at Writers Week that was thought-provoking or inspirational or funny or moving, or invite them to come over the next few days. This is obviously open to parents and community members. You know how great this is, so let them know and thank them for their continued support. Thank you to the tech crew up in the booth who is running around like crazy people at times to make sure we all look and sound great up here. Turn to those people at the end of your row right now who are taking attendance or or right in front of you, that's me, and say thank you to them for bringing you to Writers Week. Give them a little heart sign, give them I love you, one of the, I don't know what you do, what you have with your teacher, a little sign language that you got. Oh no. And thanks to you all for continually being a great audience, for asking great questions. This wouldn't happen if you weren't all into it and being a part of it as audience members, as writers up here. I know we're going to have students back up here 8th period, so thanks to you for always being so great. Give yourselves a round of applause. That would be great. All right, so today we have for you a poet. He is the artistic director of an organization called Young Chicago Authors, of which Matt Muse, if anybody saw Matt yesterday, is a part of. He helps coordinate the country's preeminent youth slam poetry festival called Louder Than a Bomb, which is in its 20th year and will be taking place in just a few short weeks here. His newest poetry collection is a collaboration with an artist named Langston Alston. It's called Everything Must Go. We are selling copies for $15 up here. We are also selling copies of a poem called Milwaukee Ave that looks like this. That is also a collaboration with Langston Alston. So we have copies of both of these for sale. This one's going to be $10. The full collection is $15. You don't want to hear me talk anymore. You want to hear him. So please put your hands together and help me in welcoming Kevin Coble.
All right, good afternoon. Good to be here. How's everyone feeling? Great. All right. So my hope is this. I'm going to read a bunch of poems. I'm a writer, and I like to read. I'm grateful for the space to read, but I also enjoy having conversations. And so my hope is that I'm going to read some things, and maybe they will spark something in you that you want to follow up on, and we can build afterwards. Just if you have questions about the process or what you hear, or the life, or whatever, what have you, we'd love to be able to engage in conversation for the last 15, 20 minutes or so. But yeah, I was here last year and really reading from a book that I wrote a few years ago called The People's History of Chicago. But I had a new book come out in the fall this year, or last year I should say, in September of 19, called Everything Must Go, The Life and Death of an American Neighborhood, which is about a particular community in Chicago called Westtown at large. It's comprised of the Ukrainian Village and Wicker Park and Bucktown. And my whole life has revolved around this neighborhood in a lot of ways. My grandfather moved to the neighborhood in 1906 from the Ukraine, fleeing the Cossacks who were coming through the countryside of then Russia and murdering Jews. And my grandfather's people were tailors. They made nice threads for the governor of that province, and so they gave him a heads up, and he was able to leave and make it on a boat called the Red Star Line that came through Ellis Island, and eventually he found himself in the neighborhood in Chicago that was not Ukrainian at the time at all. It was Irish. And my grandfather, whose name is George Marcus Koval, wanted to assimilate and not have the bigger, older, freckled-faced, red-haired Irish boys beat his ass, and so he tried to pass in the neighborhood and went by the name Murphy in the neighborhood. But my grandfather was a short, dark, squat Jew, and so the Irish boys beat his ass anyway. But the joke was on them eventually, because he called all of his cousins to the neighborhood that eventually became the Ukrainian village. And the neighborhood's changed a lot, and I write in this book about a changing neighborhood and my relationship to it and the people in it. And I write a lot about people, the people that I get to see every day. And so I'm going to start with just a bunch of what I think of as portraits of people who I knew, who were very close to me in the day. And I call them portraits because, in a way, I learn, like a lot of writers, from visual artists, and take notes from people who are painting, realist pictures of people around them. And so in my mind, this is, that kind of aesthetic, which has a lot to do with Chicago literature aesthetics, a kind of working class realism that you'll find strewn through not only Chicago literature, but art across genre. And so this is early on in the collection. It is about one of my roommates that I moved into the neighborhood with in '95. And this is called Jason. Jason dated Lena, a skinny girl from Ohio. I dated Gina, her friend from undergrad. Naturally, we moved in together. 1632 West Beach Street, the beginning and first apartment in Wicker. We worked as waiters, covered each other's shifts. I began writing in the morning like religion. Jason was trying to find something to keep him alive. His father photographed the famous for ebony, black and middle class enough to move to Evanston. His only older brother learned multiplication, how a pack becomes a brick and mortar, a laundromat front. He took pics like his pops, but the light dim in his eyes. His brother, amped, he moved to a neighborhood in transition where a shoebox could become a wall in the closet, bundles beneath the bed, the carpet littered with tiny blue bags, scales on the faux marble kitchen counter. A giant diamond appeared in one ear, a rope chain over his black tee. I came home one night before he hit the club. He left the restaurant weeks ago. There's a business card sitting on the table, just his name written in cursive, beeper number at the bottom, beaming like he is the dopest thing I'd ever seen. So that's one piece. We had a neighbor who in the neighborhood went by the nickname Mr. Rooster. I didn't know his real name ever, but talked with him every day for the year or two I lived in the neighborhood. So this is a portrait of sorts of my neighbor. Mr. Rooster grows tomatoes and jalapenos in the backyard. He offers me mint and lime, his teeth wide as rows of tombstones. Drinks long-necked bottles of Tecate from a red cooler planted on the porch. He roots on the stoop and watches Beach Street litter with children. In the lot across the way, they play on a mattress with an alley cat in the tall weeds sprouting dandelions and purple-headed flowers. His round body posts beneath the moon of a porch light. An indigenous king in baby blue jeans and a dark denim jacket. When he returns from the third shift at the butcher shop, he puts down his knife and washes the blood from his hands. We know it's dawn when we hear the release of air, the pop of the cap, the first sip as his friend strums a small guitar and night creeps to sun and the sun rises like Jesus or Jesus or just poor Lazarus who might have wanted to get some more sleep and just stay right where he was. The block calls him Mr. Rooster because he sings the Spanish blues, waking the neighborhood, announcing the new day. All right, thank you. Thank you. So I mentioned the first piece. I worked as a waiter. I've been working. I worked in the service industry since I was 11. So I basically worked as a what was first a host, then I don't know what they call them anymore, but at the time it's called a busboy, and then a food runner, and then a expediter in the kitchen, and then also a dishwasher at certain points, and then a waiter was like my kind of crown achievement in the restaurant industry. And so this was I have a long section about the restaurant in the book, a place a French bistro that appeared along Milwaukee Avenue when Milwaukee Avenue at the time was a lot of shuttered storefronts. And this popped up, and they put a sign in the window, and I was riding my bicycle down the street one day in search of a new gig, and leaned the bike up against the wall and poked my head in, and the chef and the manager were sitting down, and I got a job there, and I had that job for probably about 2.5 years. And it was easily one of the best jobs I ever had, in part because of the people who worked there. And so I wrote for the book a long series of portraits that I think of as a restaurant of poems. In the book, I'm going to share a few of those with you. This is called The Chef. The chef became lonesome for English and a good cheeseburger and returned to American kitchens a sought-after star. He opened his own spot at the end of an empty Milwaukee Avenue where Wicker's bohemian pack had not yet come. New French cuisine in a small storefront for less than half of what you pay in the bistros downtown. He ran the kitchen like a tyrant, improvising. Steaks were high and seared in butter, a sprig of rosemary. If you order the wrong dish or leave it in the window too long, a pot might come for your head. His temper like the temperature, an upstart venture on a mound of debt, some nefarious lenders, some banks, both will kill you. Chef would braise a pork chop like it was on fire. Herb Jew, just the liquid to save it. Every day he made an employee meal at 4:30 and we ate like a family. After the night, he sat with a customer or alone at the end of the bar with a glass of wine, still in his white coat, a soldier in fatigues after battle. Once in a while, he'd apologize if the pan hit you, but mostly he'd just sit and sip and teach me how an artist works, relentless and with fury. Amy, the manager, is also a Buddha, waiting tables, is learning how to juggle 3 or more hatchets at once. The moment your attention's deterred, the whole thing can go left. A busy Saturday night, its own rhythm. A couple of mistakes, the difference between a livable wage and being late on the first. The service economy is dependent upon a class or two above happens to feel. If I did 20 tables, I could leave with a baby knot. 5 shifts a week, I could cross the poverty line. Amy saw me struggle. Flustered by the demands of a big party, my mood soured by the pretentious two-top. She grabbed me mid-service. I stumbled through an evening, half the restaurant full and half my mind in a notebook, or the hope of something more. Her hands firmly on my shoulder, face inches from mine. Amy said, "Water waits for no rock. It moves around and over. That's what water does. It flows. Be like water and keep it pushing." Virgil, the sommelier. Queer as the cabaret he'd sing in on off nights, sometimes as himself, sometimes as one of the women inside. There are multiple iterations of everyone, God and grape. At the end of a night, he'd sit me at the head of the bar and lay multiple glasses like bozo buckets on the freshly wiped countertop. He'd grab bottles from dramatically lit shelves, twirling, and tell me about clubs and drugs in the 80s. A foul-mouthed showgirl, each glass a tiny taste. An entire evening dedicated to Beaujolais, Bordeaux, Burgundy. Another night solely a Semillon. Cognac's a variety of brandy, and I wanted to be down. He'd hold the glass to the light, a quick swirl to show me its legs, tell me to put my nose all the way into the bouquet, savor the liquid in the cup of my tongue, the palate expansive, floral and fruit, earth and pear there, wood and chocolate all in a droplet, an ancient monastic alchemy of origin and grain. Virgil, my fabulous professor, dancing queen, Salmonier. All right, so that's about some of the folks I worked with in the day. So, you get a little bit of bread in your pocket as a young man, and you start to think, you could do anything like pay rent, which is good. But also, you're like, I might ask, somebody out on a date. But being a young man, it usually does not go well, fellas. You know what I'm talking about. And so this is a true story, unfortunately, about this date. A girl from the neighborhood. I asked my man to ask your girl for your number, and bam. We got 22s, a honey brown, and walked the park. You said you wanted to hear something I wrote. I whispered a little rap in your ear beneath a giant oak. Met you at the gig. Vero worked there, and her husband rhymed, and we worked together, so you came to the settlement house on Augusta in the sweaty ass air of August. hair pulled back slick. Said some funny shit about the food, smiled, said you wrote a bit too, and why that's some sweet spot you put your palm to. When I said, I'll pick you up at 7, you thought I meant 8. I was on white boy time and had to wait a half hour while you got ready, and you're not really little cousin Carlos, baby giant full of slick talk and jibaritos, started to roast me on the wooden stairs I came to know your uncle built. Carlos bust out and said, yo, you look like that dude from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And all the little ones cracked rainbow-colored smiles from freeze pops melting in their hands. Carlos was victorious and not yet 11. Later you told me his father was killed a year ago a few blocks from where we stood. The sun sunk west, and all the apartments spread shadows on the ground, slow, like a sheet unfurled in the few lovely moments that suspended above the earth, the bed, your body before finally falling. We made it out on Milwaukee, walked south, and stopped in front of the Earwax, the coffee shop I knew all the bus boys that could G-weed at. You looked inside, said you weren't hungry, said you didn't eat white people food, got mad at the idea of a veggie burger. All the new faces, the white faces my own, in the glass, your eyes, whales like the school close, the lake, great ocean crossing, bacalao and Africa bloodline. You said you couldn't go there. This space wasn't for you. Wondered what we were doing here anyway. A year and a half later, we'd yell in the vestibule. You'd rip my shirt and the plastic buttons bounced down the steps your uncle built. And of course, you were right. But I hoped this was something different, or I was, or this was, the city big enough to love you in. Thanks, you. Okay, so, the book in large part is about being a young man who is certainly in search of a community, in part a crew of friends, but also an artistic community. I got lucky. I knew when I was 19 I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that I wanted to create space in my life to have the time to read and have the time to write. And so at the time, what I thought that meant is that I would get a job in the service sector, or do whatever I could. And I did a lot of things from 11 to 27. I guess from 19 to 27, I did a lot of things. I had a lot of jobs. I worked in the restaurants, but I also drove a truck and I delivered furniture, and I did whatever I could in order to support what was a real growing passion. And part of what I needed in order to do that was also a community of people who would inspire me and give me the courage to follow what I wanted to do. Because when I told my mom at 19 that I wanted to be a hip hop poet, which was not really much of a thing at that time, particularly in, that's 94 or so, she, like any reasonable working class mother at the time, she, beat the shit out of me. Because that's fair. That was like a fair, response to that idea at the time. And she was concerned with me ultimately and wanted me to be able to eat and things like this. But the community that I found in Wicker Park at that time, was scattered with not only other writers, but rappers and producers, singers, sculptors, painters, people who were into doing experimental storefront theater. But it was a vibrant and robust community that really propelled me to follow a dream that I didn't know you could follow. And so the book is also a kind of ode to the people I was around at the time. And there were a lot of different venues that I went to. There was a time in Wicker Park where, damn near any night of the week you could fall into a kind of open mic. And this is a poem about one of the places that was important to my own maturation and development, a place where I got to see a lot of the Chicago rappers of my generation, some of my peers, but some of the people I looked up to in the same spot week in and week out. This is a poem about an old jazz club called the Bop Shop. Oh, and it's accompanied by this. I'm going to talk about the illustrations in a moment, but the book's illustrated by a good young artist named Langston Alston. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is a poem called The Bop Shop. Jazz embraced its son. Old heads and kangos recognized the snot-nosed, foul-mouthed mugs and oversized denim. A Tuesday work night to put in work. When a freestyle was off the dome and the tradition of the city's great improvisers, Phil Cochran and Viola Spolin. Glasses sweat like the crowd gathered in layers before the bandstand. Hoodied monks, strong heads nod in approval, a ritual to keep the crowd moving. Young bucks might mess up, which meant heads would stop, and you could get stomped, but homeboy could return next week after practice. Raps, gymnastics, kids flipping on empty lots in a mattress, an art and kung fu dance. When MCs were swordsmen who carried words in a velvet case and polished brass when they get to the bar. All day long, a generation mumbling to themselves over the rumble of L trains. Madmen, superheroes who held down day jobs and emerged in the night with bombastic nom de plumes. There was Shadow Master, I Spy, Long Shot, Juice, Ans 13, Prime, and Capital D. Tuesdays, a proving ground, word shop, workshop, masterclass, Shogun swap meet spot to see new poets from sides of the city didn't want you to see. We were out there on division, catching wreck and getting open. Thanks. So this book is illustrated in the tradition of graphic novels and comic books. Being a latchkey kid in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, what raised me probably more than, you know, at times even I feel like my mom was, you know, comic books and particularly, you know, tapes that I had coming out of boombox. And so I wanted to, as I started to write this book over the course of a few years, and I was writing all these portraits, I wanted to also have the reader be able to see some of the people who were inside of the book. And so I called upon a young artist who was back and forth between New Orleans and Chicago, an artist named Langston Alston, who was originally from Champaign-Urbana, but was commenting on gentrification that was occurring in New Orleans post-Katrina. And so when I saw some of Langston's work, I thought that maybe he would be able to do the book, the neighborhood justice, some of the people that I ran with in the day justice, because this book is ultimately as well about a neighborhood that is in great change and thinking about some of the forces that cause that change. A thing that I'm concerned with, you know, perpetually and in this book is that we are creating neighborhoods that can no longer support the lives and livelihood of working class people that made the city and those neighborhoods great to begin with. And so it's a concern as we, you know, advance the kind of economy in the country and the middle class is dwindling. There's a continued disparity between those who have and those who have to rent. And that's a concern, particularly being a working class person in Chicago, where I've seen artistic communities and working class communities come together to create such vibrancy in neighborhoods, and then, you know, all of a sudden those neighborhoods will shift because there's there's a new class that moves in and forces the folks who have been there out. And so I'm wrestling with some of that in the book, and I'm also wanting to give the working class people a platform, like a pedestal of sorts. And I think, like, I see myself in a tradition of Chicago writers who are informed by the world around them and commenting on the world around them, and particularly inspired by the people that they see. And so this book has a lot of people in it, a lot of people who have inspired me, some of them who I know well and intimately, and some people who I come across for a moment, but they strike me as an important part of the fabric of that community. And so this is a portrait of a guy that you probably don't see because you're, you know, not 21 and older, but a guy who visits the bars in the city of Chicago, commonly known as the tamale guy, who will kind of appear you know, out of nowhere, it seems, and almost like a superhero, and like hook you up with a bag of, you know, 6 to 8 tamales for like $5 and really kind of save your life. And I think like working people are, you know, do that often. You know, there's a poem in here about the guys on Division Street who change your tire. And there's also an ode I wrote to the waitress, or really waitresses, who have hooked me up and you know, over the course of the years. And so I want to share that poem with you. This is a poem called Ode to the Waitress. Egalitarian nurse, 20% psychologist. You cure our ailments for an hour or whatever under any light, night, joint condition you find us. It's like you took a Hippocratic oath to kindness. Despite our thirsty advances, you cut down like a lumberjack. Despite the wage gap, mood wed to income, incomparable actress who brings me and my head-ass homies eggs at 3 a.m. with the grace of a film star in color vision. We all feel lovely, when you call us honey. It's not that I can be whoever I wish in front of you, but I can be myself finally without shame. High priestess of the golden nugget who bore extra napkins the morning my aunt passed. Temptress of the barbecue who touched my shoulder when dropping the tab, who loved me for a month and dropped me like the tab. You are all good to my father who holds your hand for too long and gets shooed away, and I tell him to stop, but this is light work and a heavy lift and maybe a moment to catch your breath in the whirlwind of the weeds. You are a beautiful breed who sees us all. Excuse our needs and insane demands, our idiot synchronicities. Who is more resilient than a mature dervish wheeling side dishes and heaping pots, ballerina of the foretop? You take us in and return us to the world fuller than when we came. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to read one more poem and then open it up for questions. This is, behind me you can see that this is also one of the ways that Langston is treating some of the text inside of the book, and particularly with this long poem we did called Milwaukee Avenue that was shown beforehand, that kind of accordion piece. Langston kind of, just put the text in the margins and created these vignettes and portraits as the centerpiece for the reader, for the eye, and I think really did a really good job. And so some of the poems get this kind of treatment. In writing this book, I was thinking not only about myself, of course, but also the people I came up with, and realizing, 20 years after the fact, not only do I not know anybody from the neighborhood anymore, everyone has been, they've died or they've been pushed out or can no longer afford to live there or they're in jail or whatever. And part of what I wanted to do was account for them, not just for me and my own stories, but also for the stories of the people from a place that really no longer exists. It existed in my memory and exists, here and there in old photographs, but for the most part is forever gone. And so I thought a lot about the work of Toni Morrison, as I do, as probably any writer does at this moment, over the last, 4 decades or so. But in hearing her speak in an interview, she talked as a writer about not being tied to the tyranny of the I, but that as a writer, we also can attempt to speak for a we that we have access to, a we of communities that we've been a part of, particularly communities that might not have the platform and the ability to speak for themselves, or communities that, unless we do the work of recording their stories, there'll be communities that have been forgotten. And so with the last poem that I'm going to read, which is the last poem and the eponymous poem in the book, I tried to do that. I tried to speak not only for me, but in the voice of a we, accounting for people who have been very dear to me in my life, but that I've lost touch with in a lot of ways. And so this is the final poem. Afterwards, I'd love to have a conversation with y'all, whatever's on your mind and what you want to follow up in. But this is a poem called Everything Must Go. We're looking for work, looking to move out our parents' crib, to afford some affordable housing, a 3-bedroom with 5 people, something to imagine a life of our own making. We're 18 and 22, living for the first time with roommates not our blood. We're from the neighborhood, and the one over, this one's over. Our parents split and moved to the burbs. Our auntie lives out west. We work at the new restaurant your boss just ate at. We sold as kids weed out back. We boost and rack and claim our sister's kid on our income tax. We live with our producer, our girl's girl, a giant loft of squatters. We got our shit in a bag. We got the gall to think there's something different than life intended. We're tired of working at the bank or grocer or business our parents moved here for. We drank what the elders left, 7 and 7s, gin and tonics, old turkey and old hats. We're new birds trying to fly. We drop shit like pigeons damn near daily. Styles, projects, habits, visions of what it is and what it could be. We're making it up. We mash up records and tongues. We mess up daily. We step on E with speed to meet Molly. We out here, styling, glammed up, roughneck timmed and roller skates. We house, we rave, we spend whole afternoons blunted, watching cartoons for aesthetic clues. We know the names of everyone who works the corner store. We're here to stay until the landlord says, everything must go. Thanks so much. right, y'all. So we have, I think, about 15 minutes or so. Might be wrong. Is that right?
150, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we, 18 minutes. I have, I have poems on deck, but I would love to also see what is on your mind and be able to talk with you all about anything that you want to follow up on, or anything about the writing process, about what you heard, about the life, what have you. But so yeah, if you got a question, just throw it up, and then we'll go from there. Yes.
What would you have to say as far as comments go on the current state of Wicker Park area?
Yeah, well, Wicker Park has changed a lot. I mean, I still work in the neighborhood. There's a youth arts organization called Young Chicago Authors that I'm the artistic director of. Still has our office and our performance space in Wicker Park at 1180 North Milwaukee. And you all, if you're interested in writing in youth art, across genre, both writing, music, but also we have a visual art space and have dance workshops and things like that. You can find out more information at youngchicagoauthors.org. But so I'm in the neighborhood a lot. I mean, almost every day, and I've seen it change a lot. I think that's in part the nature of neighborhoods, particularly in Chicago. But what I said, during the talk is that I do fear the way neighborhoods are going. Like, I think housing in Wicker Park it's like absurdly expensive, and so everyone that I knew, and that even my own presence, like when I moved in, I was the first white person on my block at the time, so my own presence helped to displace working class Latinx families that were there too. It's like part of that is the process of the way neighborhoods will change, but now we're in a situation where the city itself is kind of at a price point where many working class people can no longer afford to live inside of the city anymore. And so Chicago has lost, like hundreds of thousands of people, in part due to the shift in economy, or people's inability to afford exorbitant rents. And so I wonder what the future of culture, what the future of the city will be if the people who've made it great can no longer afford to be there anymore. And so it is a concern, and I think there's some answers, and there are some communities that are really good about resisting this kind of gentrification and ensuring that working people and working artists have space to make a life. But I think that that's that's an anomaly, because there are great forces at play in ensuring that people are pushed out. Yeah. Wait, I'm sorry. If you could speak up just a little bit, because I'm old. What was my favorite? My favorite comic. My favorite comic, I think, even to this day, continues to be X-Men, because it was like just a bunch of like weird kids who came together, and like underneath their weirdness, they have these superpowers. You know what I mean? And so I kind of liked. I think like a lot of kids reading comics, you think like, oh yeah, that's like, I'm a weird kid who has a superpower. I don't know what my super, you know what I mean? But like at the time, I'm like, yeah, I could like, battle rap my teachers. That's my super, you know what I mean? Like you feel like I saw myself in that too, Cool, yeah.
So what do you think that leaders in Chicago should or can do to kind of combat gentrification?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do I think leaders in Chicago can do to combat gentrification? Partly, I think like the way housing stock has been, has become outside of the reach for most working class people. I think we need to have like common sense affordable housing practices, where who reigns supreme are real estate developers who can charge, grotesque amounts for a one bedroom or a studio, or like, God forbid you have a family and want to stay in the confines of the city. And so I think like, leaders and all of us need to be asking like, what is the future of the city? Because right now I feel like we're very short-sighted, where we kind of kowtow to people who aren't even necessarily from the area, who come in and invest in building, places that ultimately I think are not well made and are super ugly, but also are not affordable for the many. And so I would like us as people to ask what benefits the many as opposed to the few, because right now I think we continue to, we continue to make so many moves and legislate for the few rather than, all of us, I would say. Yeah. What else, y'all? Yeah, hey. When it comes to poetry, do I think all of it is poetry, or should poetry?
I didn't think somebody writes poetry for themselves. Is that considered poetry, or should it have kind of rhyme?
Yeah. Right, I see. Yeah, I mean, poetry definitely does not have to rhyme. You know, I mean, and I love. I mean, the reason why I write poems is because I listened to, I think, the best poets of a generation via, hip hop cassette tapes. And so there's a lot of poets who do rhyme very successfully. But I also think some of my favorite poems are more narrative, perhaps, in structure and kind of tell a story. But I also like really experimental things that you wonder if it's language at all, or like it's blurring languages, or it's participating in like hybrid languages or multiple languages because the writer is speaks in a variety of languages. And so I think really I'm a very liberal or progressive when it comes to what constitutes a poem. Like I think whatever can be a poem. There's great found poems where you overhear a conversation, or you read the back of you read something on the train, and you're like, shit, this is a poem. You know what I mean? And so I think I think a poem can be anything, and I think we've been, as a Western canon, we've been too cute about what a poem is. But that's what we do with art anyway, and then young people kind of come in and they're like, oh, actually, let me mess up your idea about what it is, because I'm gonna tell you that it's more than that. And I think we need progressive young artists to continue to push everything forward and advocate for that new style that they're doing. That like y'all do stuff I'm sure that your parents or teachers don't understand, and I think we need that kind of experimentation in art, to make us better and more progressive and flyer than we currently are. Other questions, comments, concerns, points of clarification? Yeah. Coming up places like Fremd, what are some of the differences I noticed between the city and the suburbs? I mean, there's a lot of differences. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot, and I went to high school in the suburbs. There is just in terms of resources, in terms of the number of dollars spent on students here per the number of dollars spent on students in CPS, there's a big disparity. And one of the things that I think as a society we should push toward is a more equitable distribution of those funds, where if you're a student in the state of Illinois, let's say, then you should receive the same kind of fundamental education that every student should receive. And I know your parents and my parent wanted me to get a good education, which is why she moved us to the suburbs so we could go to a high school in the suburbs. But I wonder what that says about what we think about other people, And so, this is a very fine, and this is not to make anyone in here feel bad, right? But I think it's also a matter of fact, and I also wonder, what is our own part in making the case for equity across geography, and then how is geography also affected by race and class too, right? Fremd, I don't know how diverse Fremd is or is. The suburbs are, getting more diverse by the moment, which is a good thing. But I also think that sometimes we privilege the education of some young people just because of where they happen to end up going to school, and I don't think that is fair, And so I believe in equity. I believe in things being, all things kind of not being the same at all, but everyone having a shot at whatever they want to pursue. So just for instance, I've done probably thousands of high schools around the country, and this is a very nice auditorium. You know what I mean? I sound you can hear me. I sound decent. And in schools, they don't have the same kind of central gathering space. There are schools that don't, that can't afford to field a football team, right? Because they don't have the resources to do so, or a chess club or whatever, because of those same resources. And so, again, this is not to, make anyone feel bad, but it is we live in a privileged space, in a privileged world. We live in a privileged space because we live in this country, right? Which doesn't mean that people in this country or in this community don't have a myriad of hardships that make it very difficult to live. But as a society, I see, as I'm sure a lot of you do, continual moments, continual ways that as a system we ensure that the maintenance of this grand inequity is in place. And part of my work as a writer and a thinker, I think, is to then challenge the maintenance of that, chronic inequity, if that makes sense. Other questions, comments, concerns? Yeah? I can't tell if there's another hand or not because it's bright, but are we good? We did it? You guys feel okay? I want to say this. I appreciate the time. When you write in your, I have a office now in my house, and the desk is up against the wall, and I look at there's a picture on the back of a Gwendolyn Brooks chapbook that I have that faces me, and then it's just a blank wall. And so when you're writing, you don't know exactly who you're going to have an opportunity to share space with, or who will get to hear what you write. And so it's always an honor and a pleasure to be able to share words that you've comprised from memories that you've had with an audience. So thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity to do so. Also, Young Chicago Authors, this arts org that I work with, we work with young artists cross genre from all over the Chicagoland area. And so if you are interested in writing or music or dance or theater or visual art, Young Chicago Authors might be a space for you to meet some of your colleagues across the Chicagoland area. We do a regular open mic every Tuesday. We have Saturday writing classes. All of it's free. And then, of course, we run a festival called Louder Than a Bomb, which happens in a few weeks and will gather about 100 teams from over the Chicagoland area, teams of poets who will come together to compete. And so I invite you to learn more and participate in Young Chicago Authors. You can find out more at youngchicagoauthors.org. And if you want to stay in tune with me, or if you have questions subsequently, you could holler at me on Twitter or IG. It's just my name, at Kevin Koval, Coval. And I'm usually pretty responsive to all these forms of media. Also, they've been kind enough to get some of my books. So if you want a book, happy to sign it for you up here afterwards. But thanks to the teachers and the administration for inviting me out, and thank you all for listening this afternoon.